Hi everybody! This video, which is the first of a series of videos I'll be creating for this class, covers the first set of vocabulary terms that we'll be discussing in this class, which are word choice, word order, and tone. And I'll be going over a series of vocabulary terms in this video. These terms include speaker, word choice, which is sometimes called diction, and then the two related terms, which are denotation and connotation, and then the term word order, which is sometimes called syntax, and then finally the term tone. I'm going to begin by talking about the term speaker. When talking about poetry, we use the term speaker to refer to the narrative voice or the narrator of the poem. It's also important to remember that while some poets do write about their personal experiences, you should never assume that the speaker is the same person as the poet. In some cases, the speaker is a different race, different gender, or different age than the person who wrote the poem, and oftentimes the speaker voices feelings, opinions, or experiences that are different from the feelings, opinions, and experiences of the person who wrote the poem. So, in practice, this means that we use the term speaker to refer to the narrative point of view in a poem instead of the instead of the poet's name. So, for example, we would not say something like, in his poem, Those Winter Sundays, Robert Hayden looks back at his childhood, because that's assuming that the person who's speaking in the poem, Those Winter Sundays, is Robert Hayden, and that it's autobiographical and recounts his experiences that he had as a child. Instead, we would say, in Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays, the speaker looks back on his childhood. And when we say that, we're basically, disconnecting the person who's speaking from the person of the poet. The next term I'm going to talk about is word choice. Word choice is sometimes called diction. That's basically a fancy word for the term word choice. Refers to the specific words that writers use when composing poetry, and also that other writers use when composing works of literature. And when we pay attention to these specific words, we need to consider multiple meanings of words. So this means the denotations of words, which is their actual sort of literal dictionary definition, and then also the connotations of words, which are the emotions and ideas that are associated with specific words. And I've provided you with some examples to illustrate this difference. So, for example, a denotation of pink, in other words, the dictionary literal definition of pink is a pale red color that's named after a flower of the same name. And some connotations of pink, so some ideas or feelings that are associated with the word pink, are things like femininity and, in my case, breast cancer, because you always see all the pink stuff, the pink ribbons associated with breast cancer. Another example that I've given here is the word eagle. So a denotation, or the actual literal dictionary meaning of the word eagle, is a large bird of prey. And then a connotation of eagle is strength, grace. Also, it's, at least in our own sort of country, associated with the United States of America and patriotism. And as you can see from even the examples that I've given you here, connotations are often culturally specific. Outside of the United States, eagle might have a different kind of connotation. Or if you went to a place where there wasn't, sort of Susan G. Komen pink ribbon items available everywhere, you might not think of pink as being associated with breast cancer. But because those are prevalent things that they're associated with in our culture, within our sort of own cultural context, or at least the cultural context of the United States in the 21st century, those are some connotations that those words have. The next term I'm going to talk about is word order. Word order is sometimes called syntax, and it refers to the ways that words are arranged in phrases, clauses, and sentences. Writers can emphasize different ideas through their arrangement of words. And as an example, I'm going to go over the first two stanzas of Angela Alemo O'Donnell's poem, Messenger. The poem reads, and these are the first two stanzas, so the first two sort of verses or pieces of the poem. And they read, 5 p.m. and again, you're calling me to supper. And if you listen to me carefully as I read it, or if you read it out loud yourself, you'll notice that this arrangement of words feels different than the sentence, you're calling me to dinner at 5 p.m. again. That sentence has all the same words in it, but they're arranged in a slightly different order. And that order feels different and sounds different than the order that O'Donnell put them in. If we look at the first two stanzas of O'Donnell's poem, the first stanza begins with the word 5 p.m. So because that's the first thing we hear, that's a place of emphasis, and that emphasizes the time and the setting, and it places that word in a place of sort of emphasis so that we hear it clearly and we remember it. The next line, and again, creates a kind of pause before the second stanza, and then it really makes the second stanza pop out. So I'll read it again, and as I read it, pay attention to how this arrangement affects the way that we hear it, and also helps to emphasize different words in different parts of the poem. 5 p.m. and again, you're calling me to supper. So as I said, that 5 p.m. is in a place of emphasis, and then the sort of action, the last part of it is also emphasized because there's sort of a natural pause that happens before that. And finally, I'm going to talk about tone. So when we're talking about literature, we use the term tone to refer to the mood that's created by all of the elements, including specific words, images, and figures of speech in a poem. It's also important to recognize that the tone of a poem can shift. So a poem might start out with one kind of feeling or mood or tone. It might be lighthearted, happy, and then over the course of the poem, it might change. So it might become something darker or more ironic. It basically can change. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go over a poem that is included in the assigned readings for this week, which is Latin Night in the Pawn Shop by Martín Espada. So I'll begin by just reading this aloud, and then I'm going to talk about some of the specific words and figures of speech that I see as shaping the tone of the poem. So the title is Latin Night in the Pawn Shop, and we have this little note that sort of tells us where this is happening. So it's Chelsea, Massachusetts, in Christmas 1987. The apparition of the salsa band gleaming in the Liberty Loan pawn shop window. Golden trumpet, silver trombone, congas, maracas, tambourine, all with price tags dangling like the city morgue ticket on a dead man's toe. So now that you've heard it, I'm going to shift to another slide in which some of the words and figures of speech are highlighted. And there's a few sort of notes I've made here. And I could go into much more detail and talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to restrict myself to just a few words and a few figures of speech. So you'll see that I've highlighted the word Christmas, which is sort of in this sort of head note to the poem, which tells us where it's happening. And I've just made this note that Christmas is a holiday, obviously, that most of us associate with family and happy memories. So typically, for a lot of people and in the culture at large, it has this positive association. Although there's certainly people for whom it doesn't have probably a positive association. And then another word that I've highlighted is the word gleaming, which is a word that I see as being associated with sort of brightness. So things that gleam are full of light and they're bright. And then I've also highlighted the words golden and silver, which are also associated with bright. Like we think of these as sort of metals that shine, and also associated with wealth. So these are things that we think of associated with like treasure and money. So based on these sort of four words, we could argue that the first part of the poem, the first couple stanzas, has a fairly positive tone. We could say that it sort of has this bright, happy tone that's associated with the holidays and brightness and wealth. However, at the very end of the poem, the last stanza, we have a very different set of imagery that's given to us. So we shift from these sort of positive, bright, happy images to this figure of speech, so this comparison of the instruments. It says, with price tags dangling like a city morgue ticket on a dead man's toe. So suddenly all of these instruments are being compared to bodies that are in a morgue, which is obviously, in dead bodies obviously have a very strong negative association. They're associated with death, and the fact that these, in this sort of figure of speech that we're being given, they're in a morgue, means that they're sort of lonely and abandoned. No one is around them. So the tone of the poem here, I would argue, shifts from something that's sort of positive and happy to something that's suddenly very sort of dark and lonely, and sort of shifts the whole sort of mood of the poem from one that's happy to one that's sort of darker and sadder. So that's the end of this first video. If you have any questions about the assigned readings or about the class, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you think about the assigned poems in next week's discussion and to getting to know you a little bit in this week's discussion.